Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2020-2021 New York chapter of ARSC. As many of you know, we do these every month, and we have a tremendous privilege. We have Seth B. Winter in his sound studio, who will be able to tell us all that he does and why he does it and how he got started. And welcome, Seth.
Thank you, John. I just want to give a little bit of an introduction concerning why this program is being done. This is essentially the first meeting, officially or unofficially, of the beginning of the season that should have started back in September, and here we are at October 26th. Originally, I had done a presentation for the New York Public Library for the Rodgers and Hammerstein archives on a Zoom meeting back on July 10th. And it was met with a great acclaim. They kind of liked it, and we decided that because of the way it was recorded visually, which I had done on my cell phone, which was the only way one could do it, that Joe Patridge, who is our videographer, said we have to redo this whole thing properly so everybody will get the gist of what was going on in that program. And essentially, they asked me to do this because as of August 27th. No, it was the 28th, yes. The 28th, I officially retired from being an employee of the New York Public Library since November of 1987. So essentially, they wanted me to do this program for nearly 33 years of service to the library. And I had gained quite a bit of a reputation over the decades in the sense of my expertise in certain types of restoration and preservation of sound recordings. And they wanted to document my studio and its holdings because they felt it was an important item in the sense of recorded sound history concerning all of the material that I had worked on at the library and then how I expanded it into my own studio, which we're sitting here in South Merrick, Long Island. So, John, what do you want to ask me about?
Well, the first thing I want to ask you about is about you. Before we get to what you do, I want to get to why you do it, how you got into this. Are you a trained musician? Are you a trained engineer? Where did you start? Where did you grow up? If you would give us a capsule summary of your earlier years and how you got into doing this sort of work.
Well, it's interesting. All the influence concerning doing recordings and music and everything else came from my father, God rest his soul, and his father. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, came over from Russia in 1903 at the age of 16 to escape the Tsar and the Russian army, which he was going to be conscripted into. And he had relatives up in Canada, came down shortly to New York. He met my grandmother, who was an orphan at the age of about 14. They got married when she was about 19. And he had a passion for music. He never could play an instrument, but he had a love for music, musicians, anything that was going on in New York. He told me he was at Arthur Rubinstein's official debut in 1908, not the one when he came back 30 years later and said he had debuted. And I remember him saying something to me. I never saw him get angry about anything in music, but he got so angry. He looked at me and he started yelling. He said, "That faker, that phony." And you want to know something? Rubinstein would have agreed with him at that time. He said, "I wasn't practicing." And he was actually at Caruso's last performance at the Academy of Music during that Les Yeux d'Amore, I think it was Christmas Eve of 1920. And he remembers distinctively Caruso coming out and he had towels on his belt. And as he was singing, he started to hemorrhage. And he took the towels and started wiping his mouth. And they turned blood red, and he would drop them on the stage. And finally, he couldn't sing anymore. My grandfather was at that. That was the first time the Met never completed a performance. And my father doesn't remember it very well, but my grandparents did tell me they took him to the Caruso Memorial in the fall of 1921 that they had at the Met. And if I'm correct, they got married in 1911. They told me they used to go to performances at the Met at the Brooklyn Academy of Music because they lived in Brooklyn. And I wouldn't be surprised if they saw a number of Toscanini and possibly since they may have been dating early enough, they may have seen a couple of performances with Mahler conducting. So there was this very long lineage of interest in music that was instilled in my grandparents, my grandfather. And my father was one of 3 siblings. He had a sister who was 2 years younger than him, and then a kid brother who was 10 years younger. Now, he was the one that pursued being a musician and actually did write a film score to some Western under some pseudonym. I'm still trying to remember what it was. Someone told me one day. He went out to Hollywood and wrote it. But he wound up as a salesman for Sam Goody when Goody first opened in 1948, and then worked for a place called Liberty Music Shop, which was considered the deluxe record stores back in the 50s into the early 60s. And my father, who was an amateur pianist, told me that one day his kid brother Seymour came home, and he said, would you believe it? He said he's working at the Liberty Music Shop in the Carlisle Hotel. It was in the lobby. And he said Marian Anderson walked in and wanted Brahms' Fifth Symphony. And in 1956, for the Democratic National Convention, when Kennedy came in to introduce Adlai Stevenson for the nomination on the floor, I think it was at Madison Square Garden, the Kennedys were staying in the Carlisle, and Jackie Kennedy ordered some records, and he remembers going up to deliver a package to her, and he met her at the door of their suite that they were in. What had happened is my father tried to teach me and my brother, God rest his soul, for us to play the piano, and we just didn't have it in us. He was the pianist in the family, and he was pretty good at it, although he'd never admit it. Even his kid brother, I found out from somebody else, admitted that he said my father was the pianist in the family, the real musician. My uncle was born, my father's born 1913. My uncle came 10 years later in 23. When he started working for Sam Goody, he became a record collector and started buying first pressings from the store and from Liberty that he was going to store away, and then years down the road would resell when they went out of print. And I also remember he bought an enormous 78 RPM collection from some Italian barber in the city. My father remembers him coming home every night, armfuls of albums. You know, he'd take on the subway and then walk them home. Well, when you're that young, you can do anything. And he had amassed quite a collection that he had put away in my grandparents' house in East Flatbush. Unfortunately, in 1962, he died of the result of a car accident that he was in 1961. So the records lay dormant in my grandparents' house for several years. And it was about 1968, I was about 10 years old. My parents finally decided it was time for us to get a real stereo system, not just a little portable, nothing, portable turntable with it that could play LPs and 78s. And a few years later, my grandparents said, take the collection, it's yours. And that opened up a whole world for me of collecting. Where most people were collecting stuff in the 60s and 70s all in stereo, I'm looking at stuff that was recorded at the dawn of LPs, all in mono. And also when they did the first reissues of a lot of 78s on RCA and Columbia. And looking up all these artists and understanding who they were and how important they were. And the other thing was, my father instilled a lot of that in me too. He remembers his brother, buying these records and these artists and seeing them. And one of the biggest things that I think impressed a number of my friends was that when my father told them, oh yeah, I saw Rachmaninoff in concert. And he said he had a teacher by the name of Rose Raymer who made sure that they went to concerts. And this is the caliber of what she would bring them to. And he said the one thing he remembers is, he said not only was he big, but he said his hands were absolutely enormous. That he had absolutely no problem playing anything because his stretch was so far. I think he could do 12 keys, if I'm correct, an octave and a half. I'll show something in a bit, too, of some of the other programs he was at. One of them was at the Rosenthal 50th anniversary in 1938, where he opened up with an Appassionata, played in Carnegie Hall. I have the program. Why it wasn't recorded, God only knows. It could have been. Carnegie Hall Recording Corporation was in business at the time. So anyway, this started me down the path, as they say, all good intentions are paved as you go down into hell. That was the beginning of me becoming a record collector.
Well, I wanted to talk about you being a record collector. I wanted to get into that a little bit. Now, past your parents.
Yeah.
So From what you're telling me, you collected 78s because you got them from your uncle, and you collected LPs as well. But
And
you
40
also,
and 45s.
now,
Yeah.
were these all classical records?
Yeah, he primarily collected classical. That was his passion. But within there were some things I was able to sell at one point. I had a run of the original Elvis Presley 45s in the color paper jackets. I sold those for a pretty penny over 30 years ago. Some collector
Should have kept them.
I should have. I shouldn't have sold them now. God knows what they'd be worth. But the guy looked at them and he said, he said, not only the records in mint shape, he said the jackets were unscratched. He said, I've never seen anything like this. I said, well, they were stored away for decades. My uncle had a sense about certain jazz things, jazz items, and they were primarily on 45s. That was the way a lot of the early 45s had on them. That was what happened. RCA decided no more classical, only pop and rock stuff would wind up on 45s because the length was just right for a song. So a lot of the other companies would do the same thing with the equivalent with jazz 78s. When the 45s came in, it was a perfect conversion over. So there was a little bit. And I can tell you, because of the fact he died in 1962, we had all original mono pressings. I think I found one stereo record in the whole collection.
Okay, so you came through this collection honestly. You inherited it.
I earned
And
it the
you earned it
old-fashioned way. I
old-fashioned way,
inherited
exactly.
it, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
But how do you get from collecting records, because there are lots of people who collect
Yeah.
records, to being such a renowned engineer? How did you get into engineering? Did you study that in school? Did you just play with these records and determine how to play them? What did you do?
In the beginnings of it, the first thing you have to do is, of course, in that period in the 60s, I had a garage turntable that had 3 speeds on it. But I knew from talking to people at Sam Goody, which had opened up in Kings Plaza at the south end of Brooklyn, that you needed a certain stylus to play 78. You couldn't do it with an LP. It wouldn't sound right.
I'm going to interrupt you. Explain what you mean by a stylus. Obviously, many of the people listening are going to know. But for those who don't,
All right,
what is the stylus for an LP? What is the stylus for a 78? What's the difference?
What a stylus essentially is, it's usually a polished gem, a diamond, that is shaped in a specific width and size in order to reproduce either an LP, which is a vinyl LP of 45 or a 78 RPM disc. Concerning playing back LPs and 45s, they use a very, very narrow diameter diamond in order to track the grooves because they're very tight. Prior to LPs and 45s, we were dealing with 78s and transcription discs. Those are called coarse groove. In other words, the width of the groove is much wider, sometimes 3 to 4 times wider than a standard LP groove. So you are required to use a diamond that fits that, which is much wider, in other words, going across, in order to be able to reproduce the modulation of the grooves because they're they're cut much further apart. And as a result, you also have to get the proper cantilevers that will be able to hold that diamond such that when it requires more weight for it to play a 78, that the cantilever just doesn't bottom out and the bottom of the cartridge starts scraping against the record, making a noise. So I was studying, I found out that, well, oh great, I've got an LP stylus. And then I went to Sam Goody and they said, no, you need this certain stylus assembly to put in, which has a 78 needle in it and the proper cantilever to play 78s. So that was my next experiment in starting to play with 78s. Now, mind you, this is all, I'm 10, 11, 12 years old playing around with this. And finally, the big day comes, I am a man. Or Sam Levinson used to say, today I am a fountain pen. My bar mitzvah came and my parents said, what do you want? Oh, there's something called a cassette deck out there. Could you buy me one of those? Sure. If I had been born 6 months later, I would have had a cassette deck that had Dolby on it. This was pre-Dolby, Panasonic. It was probably no bigger than the stack of books that is sitting here and a little bit wider. Oh, was it a piece of, I don't want to say it. Put whatever 4-letter word you want to put in there. It ran off speed. It chewed up tapes. it was a horror, but at least it was the beginning of me saying, hey, I can copy something. I was copying LPs, and then I realized too, hey, I can turn the radio on the tuner, on the receiver, and I can record a broadcast that I like I'm hearing. You know, hearing at that point, well, George Sell was already gone with Cleveland. The Philharmonic was off the air, so there were some Boston Symphony things. And I remember QXR, or it was NCN, they got delayed tapes of some of the stuff from Royal Festival Hall. First time I ever heard some of those items. You know, an actual live concert coming off the air that I could record. And then the biggest thing that happened was in must have been about 75, 76. Oh no, the first thing that really got me interested in really listening to historic recordings, I have to thank the late David Hall, who was the curator of Rodgers and Hammerstein. All of a sudden, in the fall of 73, he did a series on Sunday afternoons on QXR for about 2 or 3 months. I don't know if you remember that, John. And he would play treasures of recorded sound from the Rodgers and Hammerstein archives. And he played many 78s that had never been transferred to LP. And it ran almost nearly an hour on the air, and I was avidly recording those on cassette. Unfortunately, I never saved any of them, and the original tapes to those have disappeared. We were trying to find those years ago when we were trying to put together a David Hall memorial when he passed away. I think it was back in 2011 or 12. And that really got me going. And then there was another thing that happened. WFUV got in a whole bunch of syndicated tapes called the Kusevitsky Legacy that was put together by Kevin Mostyn and Jim Schrader out in California. They had originally broadcasted, I found out, on WRVR when Riverside Church owned it. And they played those tapes, and then FUV got them. So I was an avid taper every Sunday afternoon, getting down those programs because they played every commercial recording that Cousy and the Boston Symphony had done. And
So
then,
I'm sorry.
yeah,
Continue.
and then what happened? Oh yeah, then I got an improved turntable for my high school graduation. I went from a Garrard, what the hell was it, SL65 to an SL100. Oh boy, it was much more sophisticated. It had anti-skate on it, John, which is absolutely amazing. Most of the turntables prior to that in the 60s did not. So you can imagine how LPs got chewed out. And then, of course, when did I get my first tape recorder? I think it was sometime shortly after high school. Yeah, I was going into college. I bought an Akai quarter-track deck that went 3 3/4 and 7 1/2. And how did you change the speed? You unscrewed the capstan roller. There was a knurled nut on there. You unscrewed it. You took the shaft off, and miraculously it turned into a 3 3/4 IPS machine. But I knew right away, stay at 7 1/2. It sounded a lot better.
So it sounds like you had an education mostly of trial and error.
Oh, a lot of that, yeah.
Because you went through all of these things, and then you determined, well, this sounds better than this, and you needed to upgrade, and you went to better equipment, and then better equipment. Mm-hmm. And so let's move ahead a little bit. Now we're in the 70s, but let's move a little bit. How'd you end up at the library?
Okay, well, that's another story. I had gone through 2 other careers before I got to the library. The first one I really don't want to talk about, which is what I got my undergraduate degree in from NYU, and we can pass over that. That was something my father wanted me to go into, and it didn't work out. It was a retail store. We'll leave it at that. I don't want to talk about it. And then I went back to a trade school to learn what was called then analog and digital repair. You know, it's the very beginnings of computers. This is like 1982, 83, 84. And as a result of that, I was doing computer repair. For those of you remembering back far enough, I worked for a chain called Computerland, which is now long gone, but they were the first chain of computers that actually sold PCs for the home use. That's when IBM made a fortune with their PC and their XTs. Those of you know what I'm talking about if you're from that period. These are the first personal computers that had 40 megabyte drives in them. Oh my God, you could store, the Encyclopedia Britannica on that at that time with the programs they had. And I was into that for about 2 or 3 years, and I left in a huff because it was one of those places that, well, when you're repairing computers, you could become a mule and you don't realize it until it's too late. And I just went around looking, and I went to a couple of employment agencies, and I said, what the heck am I beating my gums on this? Going back into this? These owners are all the same. They're all going to take advantage of me. And I happened to call up a friend of mine, and I said, because I had met Jack Pfeiffer at RCA Records, I had lunch with him one day, a few months before I quit doing computers. And he said to me, I said to him, are there any studios looking for engineers or trainees? So he said, well, call Jack Pfeiffer at RCA, since you know him. And then he said, talk to Tom Owen over at Rodgers and Hammerstein Archives. So I called Jack right away. He knew he knew who I was because we had met. I said, do you have any openings? He said, well, we really don't have anything now. All right. And mind you, this is in the days of the payphones. And what happened is then I threw the quarter in. I had Tom Owen's number over at R&H. I called him up. I said, Tom, are you looking for an engineer? I'm available. And he knew who I was through ARSC already, which I had been a member of for a year or two. And the first thing he said is, yeah, we do have an opening. Why don't you come in 2 days and I'll interview you?
Now, please tell us who Tom Owen was, for those who don't know.
Tom Owen was the chief engineer of Rodgers and Hammerstein Archives from 1979 to 1989. He was responsible with David Hall and David Hamilton in putting out the Mapleson box that came out in 1985, which was a complete release of every known surviving Mapleson cylinder that Lionel Mapleson, the librarian, had recorded from 1901 to 1904, surreptitiously. Some of them were actual recording sessions where he had the singer sitting there or standing there and singing, as a test. It was the first time all of them were assembled. A number of them had come out on IRCC LPs. The guy by the name of Seltzen, who was heavy into the Met, I can't remember his first name right now, but he was first responsible for having some of those cylinders reissued back in the 1940s on 78s through the IRCC, which was out of Connecticut, I think. But no one had ever assembled everything that survived. And Tom told me, he said he spent 3 years with David Hall just transferring these cylinders. And how did they assemble it? David Hall went out to the grandson of Mapleson, who was out somewhere here in Long Island, and went and picked up the balance of the cylinders that he was sitting on that nobody knew about. And he said it was a very painstaking project to put together. But Tom was also the one who had Al Audio, who came up with all the truncated styli that we used for decades, which were used not only for laterals, but for cylinders. And then I'll show something too, of which was a blessing. He and George Alexandrovich from Stanton came up with what were called biradials to play stampers, which is what LPs were pressed from.
Now, please explain what you mean by truncated and what you mean by bilateral.
Okay. Truncated was something that was devised where when you make the diamond to play back a disc, they found that because the groove is set at a 45-degree angle with the modulation on both sides for a lateral, the very bottom where it meets is very noisy. So what happens is they found that if they lopped off the bottom part of the stylus won't touch the bottom where there's no modulation. They would get quieter playback. So Tom worked with George to figure out how high up the stylus had to be cut and polished, plus the fact coming up with an assembly through Stanton that had a slightly heavier cantilever so that it could track fast warp records running at a very fast speed that had warps in them or had defects, because he had experimented with the Shore assemblies, and even the thickest cantilever they made, he said was too compliant that the cartridge would start to bounce up and down if there were too many irregularities in the surface of the disc. So that's what he came up concerning that kind of playback. He came up with glass styli to play back cylinders and pathés. Some of them, instead of being shaped as like to represent a lateral disc, many of them are vertical cut. The bottom of the stylus could either be a U shape or a ball. In other words, they went with an electron microscope and then figured out the geometry of these grooves of various discs and cylinders, and came up with different geometries to put into the cantilevers to play back these other mediums. Biradials are essentially two styli glued together, and it looks like a V. Because remember, when you make a stamper, it's a mirror image of the pressing. So whereas the grooves are going down on the stamper, they're the inverse, they're hills, almost like mountains. So you have to have a stylus that has to be able to play the groove walls, which are now, instead of like this going this way, it's like this and the modulation's over here. Because remember, you're doing an inverse. It's making, the shellac is making an impression in the metal parts, so it has to be a mirror image. And they came up with the biradials that Wyndham Hodgson, who I had got in contact through a number of collectors. In fact, I'll show you something, which is very, very funny that I still keep. Come here. Let me blow the dust off of these. This one is dated October 4th, 1983. And in here is the gentleman, oh, excuse me. No. Sorry, that was Lyle cartridges, but that's not, I kept that one. This is the one. I'm sorry. Wyndham Hodgson was the first one to come up with all these special styli in England. All right, here we go. Manufacturers of high quality styli. Yeah, he's still around. Oh, this was a later one I had done. But this is 1997. And when I had a whole bunch made, I think for Don Hodgman, God rest his soul, when he needed some material. But Wyndham was actually the first one to come up with doing all these styli, going back, I think, into the 50s. And he told me on the phone one time when I spoke to him about getting this material, certain styli made. He said, I don't know how they did it at Stanton. I still can't figure out how they glued the two styli together to create the V. He said, it drives me crazy. He said, everyone asks me for these biradials, I can't do it. So this was something that George Alexandrovich and Tom Owen came up with that was quite unique. And Tom not only came up with the styli, he also came up with the owl, which was the first modern preamp that had variable roll-off and turnover to play back various discs.
You should explain what you mean by that.
Okay. We take for granted, especially now in this day and age where a lot of people are using these turntables, have USB connections going out, that essentially any recording recorded in the electrical era starting in 1925 to the present had to be recorded with certain compensation curves. Time constants had to be put into the equalization because they found that if you tried to cut a disc with absolutely no playback compensation, in other words, like you did in acoustic where it's constant velocity going across, bass notes require an incredible amount of room, in other words, for the waveform to be etched. And they found that if they didn't put in some sort of de-emphasis in recording it, the stylus would just jump out, would just jump off the record if it had to deal with the excursion of a bass note, because it has an awful lot of energy in it. Conversely, if you're dealing with very high frequencies, where the energy is very, very little, the higher the frequency, the less modulation you have. There's an invert proportion to the way it goes back and forth. After a number of plays, they found the high-end frequencies were lopping off just from the stylus going through it. So they came up with these playback curves. And each record company had their own different combinations. EMI had one, Columbia did, RCA Victor, Telefunken, all of them when they came into the business. And the first variable playback preamp is over here. I have a pair of them. Those were the Consoletta model ones that Saul Morantz out of Queens made. And Tom kind of replicated it. He put quite a number of the curves, but not all of them on there. And he did very well with that. And in fact, this turntable over here and tone arm assembly was something else he sold. So essentially, Tom was very, very inventive, and he filled a terrific gap.
Also sounds like he was quite a mentor.
Oh, he was. He said something to me when he walked in. He said, "I've heard your work." He said, "You know what you're doing." He says, "But I'm going to show you technically what you should know about it." In other words, like what I just explained to you was everything I learned from him. Or as he did the first week or two I was there, he threw a whole bunch of books about Edison at me. He says, "Go read the part about how he invented the phonograph, and you'll understand where everything has come from concerning doing an etched disc." And that was very, very important. And then he showed me some other tricks, which we'll talk about, with playing back tapes, retrieving full-track mono tapes or tapes that have edge curl damage problems.
So how long did the two of you work together?
Unfortunately, it was barely a little more than 2 years. I came in early November of '87. He left in October of '89. So barely 2 years we worked together. If I had followed my path, I would have applied at R&H easily 10 years earlier. I would have wanted to walk in there after I had graduated from college and to work there with Tom as an assistant and then work my way up. So, he really guided me.
And how many years have you been at the library?
Well, I started November of '87, left at the end of August of 2020. I'm just short of 33 years.
Okay, and let's talk about your time at the library now. Move away from Tom and talk about you.
Right. Actually, what's funny is I came in, I forgot to tell you, when Tom called me that day on the phone, when I called Tom on the day and he said, "All right, come in on Wednesday." I came in and everything else, he says, "You're hired." He told me after he left, he said, "When you called on the phone that you were looking for a job," he said, right then and there, I hired you. He said, "I just had you come in to break your chops." I said, "Thank you, Tom." He had that wonderful, wicked sense of humor. We got along very, very well. And in fact, I helped him on a couple of the Met historic issues at the beginning. Not helped, I observed. And that's how I met David Hamilton of Opera News and of the Opera Guild, who had taken over producing the Met historic sets after Dario Soria had passed away, which ironically happened in Tom's office. Tom tried to save him, but he fell over. He just absolutely keeled over, and Tom told me, he said, "I gave him, cardiac resuscitation and screened for someone to call the ambulance. By the time they got down there, he was gone." He said every year, he told me, he said he would call up Dorley Soria just to talk to her. And they became very, very good friends. I met Dorley about 10 years before she died at 101. Quite an extraordinary woman. At that point, she could barely see. She was still smoking like a chimney. And I remember shaking her hand. She almost crushed my hand. And here's a woman who was in her 90s at that point. Quite a remarkable woman. But I digress. What do you want to put me back on the track?
This is all fascinating, but I actually want to talk about you. This is about you.
Well,
we do need the background, but now we're there, and I want to talk about you, and I want to talk about your work. And I'm actually going to digress in the library a moment.
Yeah.
I want you to talk about your work during reissues. For example, can you show me something that you did very early in your career?
Yeah, this was one. This was before I got to the library, and I think this is the reason why Tom Owens said, he says, "You know what you're doing." Let me grab it. Okay. For those of you who may remember this was, I would say, the first really major reissue I ever worked on. It was put out in 1984 on Danacord. And that was due to the insistence of Alan Evans, who now unfortunately had passed away back in June. He had gotten a passion for Ignaz Friedman, and there were very few LP reissues of his material. And to him and we both felt they were very disappointing.
Interrupt you just 1 second. Please
Yeah.
tell us who Ignaz Friedman was.
Ignaz Friedman was one of those pivotal pianists, I would say, from, let's see, he was born 1882. One of the major pianists, unsung heroes of pianists in the 20th century that was on par with the likes of Godofsky, Rachmaninoff, Hoffman. He was a contemporary of all of them, and was an incredible virtuoso, but at the same time was an incredible musician. Many of the recordings in here by many collectors are considered definitive, like the mazurkas, the selected amount of mazurkas he had recorded of Chopin, the Mendelssohn Song Without Words. And what was amazing was I didn't think there were that many recordings until Alan was able to find them all. This turned into a 6-record set with an hour on each record. And there's some incredible records in here. And that was also due to the fact that I found out from James Irsay, who has been on the radio for over 40 years, told me, he says, I'm the one that created the Frankenstein monster. I played some of the Friedman 78s on my program, and he said Alan wrote into him when he was 16 years old, saying, play more of him. He's really something. So, and he got hooked up with Dana Cord in Denmark, and we put this out. It took us 3 years to put it together, trying to find as clean copies as possible. And keeping in mind at that point, we didn't have anything like Cedar or Sonic Solutions or anything to clean these things up in the sense of surface noise. So we had to work with the cleanest copies we could at the time. Some of the discs are horrifically rare, where we were working from like 1 or 2 known copies, and we had to take what we had. And he even discovered a number of alternate takes that nobody realized that had been issued in various countries of some of the famous recordings that are in here.
Again, to interrupt for a second.
Yeah, sure.
Please tell me what an alternate take is.
Okay. An artist before tape came in would go into the studio and they had to record sides. A side would be, if it was a 10-inch disc, about 3 minutes and 20 seconds. A 12-inch disc could hold anywhere from 4 minutes up to about 5 if you knew how to squeeze it. Generally at Columbia, they said 4 minutes, 40 seconds. That's as far as we'd like to go. What happened is, because they couldn't do anything on tape, if you made a mistake, there was no way of fixing it. It was already etched into the wax or into the lacquer. So what an artist was told to do was they had to do a minimum of sometimes 2 to 3 takes. And they would have to pick the one that they liked the best, that had the least amount of mistakes and musically that they liked. So what would happen is, as Victor, if you look at their logs, it'll say D, M, and H. D meant destroy this take, M meant master, that was the one approved, and then sometimes they would put an H, which meant hold. What was the hold for? In case when they were electroplating, making the pressings, if that master should wear out and get worn out, they would use the other take that said hold on it and slip that in to replace the one that had worn out. And that's what happened on this with some of the British Columbia recordings. There were some alternate takes that somehow wound up coming here to the United States when they sent the shells. So that's what's called an alternate take. A case in point of something wearing out, and they had to go back and completely redo it, was the original version of Bing Crosby's White Christmas for Decca. It was issued just at the time of, I think, of Christmas of 41. And everyone bought it. No, Christmas of 42, that's right. We were already at war. Everybody was buying copies to send to their boys in the Army and in the Navy and the Armed Forces for Christmas. They wore out the master. They wore out the original session lacquer that they could make another one from. Crosby had to go in and re-record it because they had sold so many of them. They had absolutely worn out all the masters. And it's interesting that when you hear the original, it's not the one we all know. It's a little bit different. But that's the whole point of what we're dealing with alternate takes. So
you have a lot to be proud of in having done this set and others subsequently.
Well, this was the thing that really got me on the map. I was doing, and then I started doing stuff. The next thing was doing stuff for a gentleman who lived in Brooklyn. His name was Bill Violi. He had a label called OASI, and he put out vocal reissues of 78s. And he hired me to do some of the last things he did before he passed away in 1989 because of the fact that I had remastered a couple of programs for a mutual friend of ours by the name of Phil Stern. Now, Phil, of course, is responsible for essentially you, me, and Joe, who's the videographer, for meeting each other. Because you and I met at his apartment because you were looking for some rare Feuermann recordings he had. And we met, I remember one evening you came in, and that's where I also met Alan Evans. He happened to come over, and I was there. I was friendly with Phil already. So
Phil has a lot to answer for.
oh, yeah, he was one of my staunch supporters at the beginning. He thought I did terrific work, and it was from those presentations I remastered for Phil at the Vocal Record Collectors Society that Bill Violi, the head of this company, OASI, and the record dealer, approached me to do masters for him. By the way, I can add a little funny story about how he got the name OASI. Originally, he wanted to call the label Oasis. And when he sent it to the printer said, Bill, we can't use that. There is a company already using that name. What, he was going to go do a title check or a copyright check? Who did these things? It just so happened the printer was doing it for another company and they had that label. So Bill said, all right, drop off the S at the end and we'll just call it OASI, which in Italian is Oasi. It means the same thing. Well, one person looked at it after hearing some of his product and he said, I know what OASI stands for, old and scratchy items. And then when someone heard the story, he dropped off the S. He said he should have dropped off the O at the beginning and called it As Is. Oh,
That's very funny.
yeah, that's one of the classics of the beginnings of that. Now let's see, we go into the 80s, and then it was thanks to Alan Evans that when CDs started to come in, he approached John Wade of Pearl, Pavilion Records. And that's when, in 1991, we started down the path of doom again, creating CD masters. And the first thing we did for John was Sir Hamilton Hardy Conducts Berlioz. And I got to say, it still sounds pretty good, although I wish I had Cedar or one of the other programs at the time to get rid of some of the clicks and pops in those damn records.
Can you play for us any before and afters? Do you have that available at this time?
Not really. No, I have some things that are cleaned up.
Well, I'd like to hear some of those.
Okay.
Would you talk about, because we talked about your work, but we haven't played any music.
Right.
And it's time to play some music. I'm going to actually leave it in your hands. Tell us what we're about to hear, why
Okay.
you chose it, why you think it's good or not.
Okay.
Please, go ahead.
All right. Well, as some of you know, because of my passion for Toscanini, when I came to the library, within 2 years after starting there, which I actually came in, believe it or not, on a 6-month grant from the New York State Council on Preservation. That's all the money they had just to pay me salary. No benefits or anything for 6 months. And because I had done such good work, Tom Owen went up to Don McCormick, who was the curator, and he said, you make sure that you get these grants for Seth. And then it took 2.5 years that they finally put me on salaried. And at that point, I was the engineer appointed, and that's the reason why I wanted to work there. They finally unpacked the Toscanini legacy, which had been in storage since 1970, when Walter Toscanini had to find a place for it. And it was in 1986, because Reagan had changed the contribution rate concerning donations. For 1987, Wanda Toscanini Horowitz finally went into negotiations with the library to make that collection a gift. It had been sitting on deposit in the basement in boxes. In fact, John, you had seen it at one time before, in those boxes before I opened it up about 5 or 6 years earlier, if I'm correct. And I was given the task of unpacking everything, which was, I would say, several thousand 16-inch discs, probably 10 to 20,000 reel-to-reel tapes that had to be gotten through.
Can you show us what a 16-inch disc looks like?
You're looking at one of them right now. Actually, this is, I'll show you a 16. This is a 17.5-inch disc, which, why did they make these? Because when you had to make a 16-inch pressing, you had to use an oversized lacquer to do it in order to create the metal part that had to be bigger than the actual pressing. A 12-inch disc is a 13 and a quarter or 13 and a half size disc. I could show you some of those too. But this is essentially the largest instantaneous disc that could be made.
What's an instantaneous disc?
An instantaneous disc is one that you could cut into the surface, cut modulation into it. You can actually see it on here. And then you could play it back right away. That's what's called instantaneous. In the early days, when they cut them into wax, you couldn't play the wax right away. You had to go through a 3-step process and make metal parts, then press it, and then be able to play it. This afforded the ability of being able to play back something right away for rebroadcast purposes if needed or as a reference. And the other beauty is that when you put it on a 16 or a 17 and a half inch disc, you could get anywhere between 15 minutes and almost 18. Essentially what's on here, which I'm going to play for you with excerpts from, are two orchestral pieces that run nearly 17 minutes.
I'd love to hear those.
You will. In fact, we're going to start with the first one now. This is from one of the pioneers of engineering. His name was Mirko Penjenko. And it says on here, MP Concert Installations. If you go into programs from Carnegie Hall starting about 1935, and you look in the back for the advertisement, you'll see it'll say MP Concert Installations, and he has the MP in a diamond. He was the first one to set up high-fidelity sound systems for the very rich and cutters. And he made a fortune at the time. He went bankrupt in 1952 trying to come up with high-fidelity television. He was just ahead of his time, unfortunately. We have a chance. I have an article showing the gentleman and in his studio. And he was called in to also build sound systems for various schools, PA systems. And there's one he's built. He's standing in front of it with amplifiers, with the biggest transformers and power supply caps you ever saw. And the damn rack is about 2 feet higher than he is. So it gives you an idea of how powerful a power amp he was working on. And this is in the 50s with tubes, that he was able to do that to, like, power, to fill the room of a gymnasium or a big auditorium. He was called in the Northeast. In fact, he, according to Steve Smolian, he may have been also instrumental in helping Renee Snepvangers develop the LP for Columbia in 1948, along with George Shirley, who was up in Tuckahoe, who was cutting styli. And he's a very interesting person. And how did his collection kind of come to me, and it came to another private collector by Gene Paglioni, was that at one point he was selling his material off in the early 70s. And Roger Frank got in contact with him somehow because I think Penjenko walked into Willie Lerner's shop at Music Masters. And Willie was the source of connecting people. And I think Willie got Roger in contact with him, knowing he had stuff there that Roger could issue that Willie could sell on LPs. And when he saw all the Toscanini material in there, he called up his friend Tony Paterno, who was looking for stuff. And they bought material such that Roger took the non-Toscanini, Tony kept the Toscanini material. However, this one was from Roger's collection that Gene Paglioni wound up with after Roger died, because this, on the flip side, was something that Roger wanted, which was the first movement of an Emperor Concerto with Sirkin and Ionesco from 1938. Any tapes that float around of it come from this disc. There's only one source, and it's that. So the first thing I want to play here to give you an idea of what Penjenko could do.
And what you can do.
Well, this was also a trick. This disc is not cut very well. It's one of his experimental discs of the period. He had a beautiful handwriting. I don't know if you can, Joe, I don't know if you can hone in on that, but his script was just absolutely beautiful. I wish some of these discs were, in the sense of being able to play them back. They do have problems. As the late C.J. Luton, who was involved with Toscanini, said when he heard some of these discs, Penjenko's discs are like the little cute girl with the curl in the front of her head. When she's good, but when she's bad, she's worse. There are discs of his that play beautifully, and then there are discs that are very problematic to play back, and which doesn't surprise me. Here's a guy who would install stuff and repair it, and his own equipment was not in the best of shape half the time. In other words, you get some of them where you put it on, And you hear all sorts of noises and buzzes because he has a bad tube or a bad socket somewhere in the system. And he never repaired it for months. So you got to run a broadcast that it sounds like there's a lightning storm going on through everything. Or as you'll hear in one of the excerpts, there's some pitch instability because he didn't maintain his tables. Very, very frustrating. But when stuff is clean, it's remarkable. And this is one of them that I'm going to play now. This is part of the Oriente Overture from February 12, 1938, with Toscanini and the NBC Symphony in Studio 8H. Now, since I worked on the Toscanini Legacy, I had the privilege of working off of not only the NBC reference discs that were cut for that broadcast, also the RCA pressings that were cut down at RCA into 17 and a quarter inch lacquers like these, and then pressed up on vinyl, or actually what was called Victrolac, half shellac, half vinyl. Neither of them sound as good as this, and I can't figure out how he did it if all he's doing is using an AM tuner. So here's the end of the Oriente Overture from February 12th, 1938. And by the way, see if you can hear the horn mistake in one of the pauses. Well, it's because of them. I'm here. Right. There's the whole play. Okay, I will. Something you can leave that, you can leave it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, get ready. All right, hold on. Watch it here, you'll see.
That was amazing. Please tell us something about that beyond what you've already told us. It was incredible sounding.
Whoop.
That wasn't incredible sounding.
No, that wasn't. That's a false start, but we're going to hear that too. That's the kind of work Penyenko did. And because of the fact he's gone now over 20 years, Roger Frank is now gone 16, and Tony Paterno's gone 3, all the secrets of how that was done is in the ether. I still can't figure out how he did it, because if you listen very carefully again to that, when you hear that last note, you actually hear room tone and resonance in 8H, which was always blamed to be incredibly dead as a doornail. And I don't remember that kind of resonance on the NBC and RCA references, which were cut either down at 24th Street or in Studio 7H right down below, the 8H, where they had all the recording room.
And those were recorded off the line, weren't they?
Off the line.
And what's the difference between off the line and the way this was recorded?
Well, okay. Off the line means that it was off the network line coming from the mixing board directly into the network in the room. In other words, it didn't go to the transmitter and then get compressed and then sent out to the airwaves and picked up by a receiver. A receiver is an air check. This purportedly is an air check. But I'm beginning to wonder.
Assuming it's an air check, This is basically what people heard on their radios if they had good quality radios at
If
that
they had
time.
one of his systems, yes. But I don't know how he tweaked it, because the RCA and the NBC feeds don't sound this clean. I don't understand it. And the thing is, I did some research. If you go on Wikipedia, in November, December of 39, that's right, it was November, because we have some of the Penyenko tests, NBC set up a third station. They had WJZ and what the heck was the other one? Do you remember?
WEAF.
WEAF. But in late 39, they set up another one that was called wide frequency that went up to 10K. And I have examples of that in Penyenko's collection, and they sound almost as good as the NBC references from that period. But in 1938, there was no such animal. And
This isn't even FM, is it?
this is not FM, supposedly. I'm beginning to wonder in this period if Penyenko may have gotten a line somehow, telephone lines, up to Connecticut where he had his barn and his farm. Apparently, when Tony Paterno went up there, he said when you stood on one of the hills, you could see the Empire State Building. And that's where they set up the transmitter in January of 41 with Armstrong, Edward Armstrong, to do experimental FM. And he was the first one to record some of those broadcasts in FM in that period. In other words, he had a clear shot from the Empire State Building. The problem was his equipment was all screwed up with all the spurious noises in it. So the man is, these are unfortunately, unless there is somebody out there who knew these people, I'm more than happy to talk to them. If they know anything about what kind of black magic Mr. Penyenko was doing at the time.
Well, it sounds like you haven't lost any of your interest in this or any of your passion.
Well,
you're as interested in this as you were when you started.
We're going to thank you. We're going to hit some things that was just recently discovered that had been stored away for decades, of some material that you will not believe when you hear it, and you hear the announcer come on, of some Philharmonic broadcasts. I'm going to be playing something. It's the only known live excerpt of Sir Thomas Beecham conducting the New York Philharmonic in concert.
Well, let me digress a moment.
Yeah.
Why do you care? Why is this important? Who cares about these people? Why does it matter what happened 60, 70 years ago
This
with
is our
people who are
musical
long dead?
This is our musical heritage. This is what shaped New York. This is what shaped America and their musical tastes. Remember, radio was what television was, or now the internet, where I'm showing my age. People used to sit and be absolutely fascinated listening to the radio all day long. While Fredo Toscanini, God rest his soul, told me, he said, the moment I came over here from Italy in 1938, he said, I was glued to the radio. He said, I knew every radio program that was on at the time. He heard all of them at the time, not only his grandfather on the air, but all the popular shows, all the newscasts. People sat there and listened to that. That was their form of entertainment.
And it requires somebody like you, I take it, in order for us to be able to hear this today.
Well, that's the trick. I mean, I'll show you once we move things about the array of style I have. To play this cockamamie record, I tried all different sizes, and believe it or not, he was experimenting with pitch and depth on these. And I found that a very narrow stylus gave us the results you heard. If you play it with something you think that's very wide, the stylus just skates right across the top of the grooves.
So all you need to do is find the right stylus, and then you're done.
No, that's 99% of the trick. Then you have to figure out the playback curves that I was talking about, and that's the beauty of these Marantz preamps that I have, that they have all the known curves on them. However, if Gary Gale is listening, Gary up there in Potsdam, he has built his own archival preamp that is much more flexible than the Marantz's, and has certain other switches on it, like a lateral cancellation to play vertical cut discs like Pathé's and Edison discs. And he put in all the known playback curves there. His has, I think, 2.5 times as many playback curves as the Marantz does. So you can get all those different time constants that may fit certain recordings better in playback. No, it's for bass compensation and treble roll-off. And That's another trick, and that's something that Tom Owen showed me how to do. There are little tricks in that, but essentially, any engineer worth his salt, after a while, has the experience. They know when they hear a recording where the playback curves would lie, just by sometimes knowing a run of discs, experimenting with them, and knowing what studio did them, or what record company, or by listening. Because, as we said, for every rule, there's always an exception. You know, the early Columbia LPs were pre-RIAA, which is the standard playback curves that are used on all modern LPs. And theirs was a specific curve. I found certain Columbia LPs from that period where the curve was modified, and it doesn't sound right with the settings they suggest. And fortunately, because you have variable playback curves on these preamps, like the Owl, like the Marantzes, and what Gary had made, and also Time Step puts out something and KAB does, you can approximate getting it back to what's called a flat response. Now, I'm not going to go into, there's an argument, what do you call a flat response? A flat response is doing the de-emphasis that was created in the pre-emphasis of making the recording. Flat response means that what you hear is the equivalent of what was heard in the studio as it was going into the microphone. That's my definition of what is called a flat response, no coloration.
Okay.
Say.
So, you have to pick the right stylus. You also presumably have to pick the right speed, I assume.
That's another thing. Right.
Please talk about that.
Well, that little darling I got here, which I actually have to thank Art Fierro for, the producer at BMG, who I work with on the Toscanini collection. This is a little baby called the Korg tuner. This will tell me if I'm on pitch or not at any A I need, anywhere from 435 right through up to 4. What's the standard now? About 443, 445 with modern orchestras, if I'm correct.
Depends on the region in the U.S.
U.S. is what, up to 442 now, Joe?
Well, U.S. some orchestras are at 442, other orchestras are at still at 440.
440.
But in Europe, they're up to 444, 445.
5. The only orchestra, to my knowledge, in the United States that was at 445 was Kusevitsky in the Boston. And I found out why. He got them up that high. You can't take the wind players, you know, the flute, oboe, bassoon. You can't just shorten it. Shorten the, it's push the bell in and shorten it because the relationship between the holes are not correct. In other words, it'll go out of tune. So they had instrument makers up there to readjust the holes so that the strings was no problem. They could tune up. It had to deal with all the wind players. All their instruments were modified. Kusevitsky liked things a little sharper. He said it sounded clearer to him, a little brighter.
So you not only need to know, or at least make an educated guess, at what the orchestras or the instruments tune to.
Right.
But sometimes, isn't it true that discs aren't at a standard speed?
That's true, and I can show a little demo here at the next piece we're going to bring in. And that's how, okay, there we go. Let's see if I could show it here. All right, hold on, let me get something else here. Well, let's see if it'll come up on this one. Invariably. Okay, here we go. Let's see if this will show up. Let's get the resolution a little better. All right. Give me just a moment. What happens is, with most material of this period, everything done electrically, there is a certain amount of what's called AC hum that leaks through. You got to remember that we use what's called alternating current to deliver the electricity to wherever it has to be used. All equipment, none of the equipment can use alternating current coming in because it changes direction 60 times a second. That's called 60 hertz. So what they did is they had to come up with what were called power supply filter caps. And what these do is they hold a charge and convert the alternate current to direct current. And as a result, that's what essentially powers everything from these preamps, amplifiers, to the computer monitors we use. However, in those days, the power supplies were not very good at filtering, and they couldn't hear it over the sound system. So what happened is there's always some amount of power supply leakage that if you put equalization in at 60 hertz or at 120 and boost it, you'll hear a hum. And what will happen is, if you want to check to make sure something is on pitch, let me just look here. Maybe I could see it here. This is a really good example because there's instability in it. But here you can actually see that this recording has a bit of instability. You see how wavy everything is? And there's a 10 kilohertz heterodyne, and it's not straight across. In other words, this is instability in the playback in the record turntable. But
So you're also a scientist.
Oh yeah, you have to be. Okay, here. This is what I'm trying to hone in on. Okay. Right here, I'm going to point over here. This shows you something going on. This is some rumble, but over here is a harmonic of the power supply hum. This line going straight across, and this is sitting at about almost 180 hertz. That's a multiple of 60 hertz.
How can you tell that's 180?
By the graph over here. See it? It says 180. There's the line. There's the harmonic of the hum. The primary hum is down at 60. It's very hard to see. There it is. And then you got, it's cockamamie here. He's got one at 90. It should be somewhere at about 120, and it's not. There's something going on in his system. But the speed that I got this at by tuning it to the orchestra at A440 coincides with the fact that I've got 180 hertz hum. That means the disc is on speed. That's how you also determine Boston Symphony broadcasts. If you're not sure of the A, try A445, put into a program like that and look for the hum. That's how I did the Robert Johnson material with Stephen Lasker for the Centenary in 2011. He had perfect pitch. He pitched them, and I called him up. I said, you're good. He said, why? He said, when I went into retouch, I saw the 120 hertz harmonic in it. Meaning I said, you got every disc on speed.
Okay. So
These are the tools you need. You can't hear them. You have to see them.
all right, so let's go
You
back
got to have
to
pretty damn good ears to know that something's sitting at 120 hertz.
let's go back to this disc
Yeah.
again. You take the disc.
Yeah.
Do you have to do anything to it? To prepare it in any
Well,
way
we'll go
before
in
you
the
put
other
it on
room.
the
Yes, I'm
Okay.
the biggest proponent of the Keith Monk's record cleaning machine, which was something Tom Owen bought for R&H. And when I saw that, I saved up my shekels. And 3 years after I started there, I bought one.
Now what does it do?
It cleans discs up to 16-inch. It is the only one out there that will clean coarse groove and micro groove records with no problem, because it has a unique vacuum on it that will suck, once it's wetted down with the brush that comes with it, that works in getting all the crap out of the grooves. It will remove all the dirt on a record.
Is it only dirt that you have to remove?
Dirt. Sometimes there's palmitic acid on the lacquer.
What is palmitic acid?
That's an oxidation of the castor oil. That is the lubricant that was made to make the solution that the base discs are dipped in to make the lacquer. That's the lacquer that's on that's this coating on the disc.
So that isn't actually the disc. There's a disc underneath that.
Yeah, well,
some
no,
kind.
it's a covering. This black is lacquer.
What's underneath? What's
The
underneath
core
the
under
lacquer?
this one is aluminum. This is, by the way, one of the first of the Prestos. I think if you could see a little bit of that green, I'll find one. Oh, I'll show it to you in another way. But that little green underneath, Penyenko put his own labels on these. And he used to cut inside out. You know why? Because it was easier to case the chip as it came off, as you were burning and etching. So you could brush it away. NBC was doing that until the middle of 1938. They went from the old GE cutters to the Scullys. And there they had a vacuum on it that would catch it, so they were able to cut outside in. And you didn't have to worry about chasing it as much.
Which do you think is better?
The cutting outside in many ways.
Why?
Because of the fact that you're using a heated stylus. The earlier ones were not. They just burnished Tom Owen showed me the difference at NBC. The problem was also, like he did here, but because he was burning and etching, do you see how far that margin is? The linear speed is so slow here that the sound is not really terrific. It gets better as it goes further out because you're going at a faster speed around on the disc.
So if this is a recording of a live
Right.
performance, yes?
Right.
Does that mean that the sound on the very inner part is not as good as the sound on the outer part?
That is correct.
Okay, if that's the case, how do you mix them together if you're doing, I assume what would be an overlap, wouldn't it?
If you had to do an edit, yes, you would have to put it in 2 different streams on the editor and then come up with an EQ pull that you would gradually put in or take out with a various equalization to try to match the sound when you're going from one side into the other.
That sounds really complicated.
Oh, it can be very complicated, especially when you're dealing with some of those NBC discs that are cut inside out. I remember a couple of the Met broadcasts trying to put those together and coming up with an incredible equalization pull when I went from the outside of one disc onto the inside of another and had to butt it together.
That must be awfully jarring.
It could be very annoying, but there are ways of getting around it.
And so when you're done, when you're finished with
Yeah.
this, it should sound like there's no edit there. Is that right?
That's correct. It should be seamless if you know what you're doing.
Okay. And so you have this disc. You've now cleaned it.
Yeah.
When you put it on, do you have to do anything to the disc in any way?
Well, first thing is I got to center it on the turntable because most of these discs are cut slightly off center.
Well, what would happen if you didn't do that?
You get wow. You
Give
get
me
pitch and
give me an example with
well,
your voice.
like instead of it being it goes
Oh, that's annoying.
Oh yeah. Actually, we're going to get to something that does have that in there, but the sound is so remarkable. There is a program. There are a number of programs out there that can fix that. Cedar has Respeed. There is also Capstan is another one that will work fairly well in fixing that. But each one has their pluses and minuses depending on what you're processing. I heard that Capstan has a problem when it deals with voices, with a vibrato or violin playing. It'll even out the vibrato, and which will cause problems.
So I take it then that this isn't a black box. You can't just simply put it in there, push a button, and you're done.
I've had this system. I got a new one last year for 11 years, dealing with Respeed, dealing with the Cedar Cambridge system. Everything you come up with, there is no way of just pushing a button and walking away. You have to deal with each incident as it happens.
So it's not one size fits all.
Absolutely not. And you have to know what the heck you're doing with it, because I've heard people, some of them when they first got the retouch, trying to take out noises, and it's like, oh my God, what did they just do to this thing?
So you can overuse them then.
Oh, you can abuse them, believe me.
And how do you avoid doing that? Because I assume you're trying to get rid of every little problem. How do you avoid going too far?
Oh, you know it. You know when you've taken out too much, all of a sudden you've changed the color of the frequency response. All of a sudden, something that should have a frequency response up to 15K sounds like it's coming out of an AM radio, because you're trying to get out a scratch that's in the upper end frequencies. And what's happened is, yeah, you removed the scratch, but you've taken the overtones with you. And that's what a lot of people don't understand when they try to use these restorative modules. It will, and it drives me crazy. I can hear these things all the time.
Okay, I'm going to give you a project.
What?
And I'm going to give you these discs, and I'm going to say, I want this to be perfect, best you can do. How long does it take you?
On
Start to
these,
finish. From
Each of
my
these
handing
things-
you the disc, to cleaning the disc, to centering the disc, to working on it in your computer. If you worked nonstop, without a break, how long would it take?
Probably each of these selections would take about 3 hours to restore 100%.
How long How long of music is that? How much music is that for 3 hours of work?
Oriente is about 8 minutes. Sorcerer's Apprentice is about 9 minutes. So we're looking probably, if I had to prepare this for CD issue, or to get it public, to be remastered properly, you're looking at about 6 hours worth of work right there.
6 hours? That sounds like an awful lot.
Well, there was a joke I said to Gary Gaylor when I got Retouch. I said, Gary, I got good news and bad news. He said, what's the good news? He said, I can remove every tick, pop, and noise in a recording. What's the bad news? I can remove every tick, pop, and noise in a recording. And one time we were working on a Toscanini broadcast he wanted to take back with him the next day. And I'm listening to it, and I can hear the level rising and their noises, and I'm trying to fix it. And at one point, Gary yelled at me, Seth, I just want to hear the concert. I'm leaving tomorrow morning. You know, that kind of thing.
So how do you know when to stop?
When your ears fall off and you can't see straight after being in a session for that many hours. No, many a times I will work on things, walk away from it. In fact, I'll show you an example of that in a bit. Walking away from it for 6 months sometimes, if it's something that I really want to work on, and then come back to it fresh ears, because what will happen is your ears get very accustomed to some of the imperfections, and they go by and you don't realize it because there were so many of them.
So you get ear fatigue, maybe?
Absolutely. It's also ear fatigue, but it's also a kind of a mental fatigue. No wisecracks, folks. A mental fatigue that your mind, your brain is starting to fill in the, no, it doesn't realize the imperfections sometimes because they're all part of the signal. So many times you have to just walk away from it and then come back and say, you mean I missed that? Wait a minute, let me fix this, let me fix that. You know, especially if it's something that is very problematic. I'll put it, one of the things I'm going to play is part of the Benny Goodman Carnegie Hall concert. And that's something I started putting together 2014. I'm still working on it, carving away at this thing because of the problems in it. And I'll explain that later when we get to it.
Well, actually, I would like to hear some more of your work. Could you play something else?
Sure. Let's hear the loudest spot in the Dukas Sorcerer's Apprentice from the same broadcast. Now, you'll notice, as good a sound as the Oriente is, this is even better because of the fact it's cut in the middle to the outside of the disc. So the linear speed on the outside is much faster, meaning you're putting the same information in more area, as opposed to less area traveling around on the inside. It's just like when runners are on a track, the guy on the inside doesn't have to go that far around the circle, whereas the guy all the way at the far end, in order to be at the same spot where the guy is on the inside around, the one has to travel much further distance to get there. That's the equivalent of putting that same amount of information on a disc.
But in this case, that's a good thing.
That's a good thing, yeah. In fact, Joe, if you want to pull in on here, you can actually see something. If in the reflection, you could see where the high-end modulation is here on the outside and how much brighter it is than the high-end modulation on the inside because the linear speed is faster. It's in more of an area. It's the equivalent of recording on the inside on a cassette at 1 7/8, and by the outside you're on a 15 IPS reel-to-reel tape. The difference in frequency response.
Well, I actually want to talk to you about tape at a later point.
That's another headache.
Let's hear some of that Dukas Sorcerer's Apprentice you mentioned.
Right. And this is what really is unbelievable in the sense of the clarity. And I don't want to go into it. I have one of those RCA pressings cut off the line. It doesn't sound as good as this. That's why I would have loved to have sat down with Penyenko and speak to him about what kind of black magic was he pulling here.
Well, let's hear some of your black magic.
Okay, here we go. February 12th, 38, an excerpt from The Sorcerer's Apprentice of Dukas with Toscanini and the NBC Symphony in Notorious Studio 8H.
You're right. That's even better than the other recording you played.
Yeah, yeah. Now we're going to go into something that's even an advance for Panenko. This is now December 3rd of 38. Let me do a little switcho changeo, as they used to say. As you can see, the condition of these sleeves. These have to be made up. These are special 17.5 inch. And nothing like a Dennison label to tell you what's there that he put on each one. And he had his own number markings. And he had a catalog, which I have, referencing back these discs of when he was doing material. One of the things in there I can't find is a broadcast of the Marx Brothers with Carol Lombard and I think Noel Coward from 1939 that Paterno told me was hysterical. I can't find the disc. I can't find the tape of it. So I don't know.
That's a real shame.
Yeah,
Hope
I
you
don't
find
know.
that.
I don't know where it went to. All right, so, but it may still be in here somewhere. Now, let me just gently put this little darling here.
Now, do you always keep them in their original sleeves?
Yeah, I am of the same thought as Tom Owen did. He said, don't clean it until you're ready to preserve it, because you don't know what could happen by just cleaning these discs, that it could start some reaction that the lacquer could start to delaminate on you if you're not careful.
What does that mean?
The lacquer will lift right off the base because it never adhered properly and it has started to get brittle from age. It had to do with the formulation of the lacquer and sometimes the base.
Well, how often does that happen?
It's all over the place. It all depends which company, when they were made. There are certain runs that we know that they have gone bad. There are others that start to pit that came from advanced lacquers that NBC bought in about 1946 till 49. That Johnny Corbett, God rest his soul, who was the original engineer up at Wave Hill with Walter Toscanini, told me, he said, yeah, I was there. There was some guy in the purchasing department who was on the take, and he was getting a kickback for buying it from them. And then they found out about it and they fired him, but it was too late. There's almost 3 years of material in the NBC radio collection that are on those discs, and they've all pitted and oxidized.
Well, if this happens, let's say you have flaking off a disc, what happens? What can you do with it?
Depending on if you have all the pieces, that's one thing. There's something called Irene that may be able to play it back, which is a digital scanning process. It's still in an early stage. It's going to get better, but it's still not at the point that it's like dropping a stylus on a record and capturing everything. If pieces are missing and gone, Irene may actually be able to fill some of that in, but if a lot is gone, it's gone.
So what should someone do if one has such a disc?
Well, call some experts and send some pictures and see what it looks like and see what to do with it. Some of it may be retrievable with a stylus. Some of it may be retrievable digitally. Sometimes it may not be retrievable at all. Now, for example, on this one. Now, if one of our illustrious members, Dr. Beale, is watching, and he claims that there are no aluminum discs glass discs prior to 1942. I'm holding in my hand one from 1938.
What does a glass disc mean?
Glass means that instead of the base being made out of aluminum, it's actually a piece of glass.
It looks the same.
Yeah, that's what you think. If you put it up to the light, Joe.
Wow.
There's
the illumination.
There's the illumination.
Lower it a little bit.
Yeah.
A little bit.
There's the illumination. That tells you got a glass disc.
Huh.
And if you look over here, you see those little light streaks? That's the lamination of the disc. And that's happening on the other side of it. Now, somewhere in here, some of them have it. This one doesn't have it, but some of them are etched, and they say in a made in Holland. These were they were done by some company. And these are the kind of discs. And by the way, here, this is what I'm talking about, the delamination. You see that bump down at the bottom? That's the lacquer coming off. I can play it up to that point. It's part of a Siegfried broadcast from December 38.
With whom?
Not Melchior. What's his name? I can't remember. Oh boy. Lahome, I think his name is. And this may be the only source to that broadcast. NBC wasn't recording the broadcast in that season. So this is what Penyenko took off. And the other side of this is the Rienzi Overture with Toscanini from the same day. And part of the Siegfried is on here too. And as you could see, parts of the discs are starting to, there's a piece of lacquer missing right there. It's hard to see because of the glass. But this disc doesn't have long to go.
Now, why did they use glass?
I don't know. I really don't know what they were doing. In fact, that's the reason why when they tried to do the Mengelberg-Beethoven cycle on Philips in '61, they couldn't find an Eroica. They said the discs were broken. It was because they were recorded on discs like these.
Yeah, I was gonna ask a question about the,
Yeah.
The durability issue,
Eesh.
not only in terms of
I'm going to put this here.
how it,
Yeah.
not only in terms of how
Yeah.
its breakability,
Yeah.
but in terms of its playback durability. Do glass-based lacquers play back
Well, there was
better than aluminum-based?
there was a theory at one point that I heard from somebody. I don't know how reliable it was, but they were experimenting with glass-based discs as early as late 1940, at least at NBC. Presto was making some. The theory was glass is a softer base than aluminum, so that when the cutting style is cut and burned into the lacquer, because the substrate underneath was softer, they believed they were getting better sound.
Have you found that to be the case? Is there any consistency at all?
You want to know something? It is very hard to tell because of the fact that even, like, I know of a number of Toscanini one broadcast in particular, where Walter Toscanini wound up with all the surviving discs to one, and some were on glass, part of it was on glass, part of it was on aluminum. But it's hard to tell because they were done on different sets of cutters that had different frequency responses.
So you've never found a particular recording that was done glass and aluminum from the same person?
Unless both machines were absolutely tuned the same way, in other words, the frequency response and the cutting was exactly the same, it's hard to tell. Although, after 1941, I can tell you something at NBC, the sound, especially on the glass disc, sounded better because they had overhauled all their boards and had put in new microphones and new preamps.
So nothing to
And new
do with
cutters.
the material, but having to do with the recording.
Yeah, part of it, some of them believed that they said it sounded better. The only way you could have done it was if somebody went into the studio and recorded someone live, went into a local studio, and they said, all right, do a take on the same cutter, on a glass one and an aluminum, play them back and see. And I don't think anybody ran that test.
Or if they did, you don't know about it.
We don't know. I mean, we're talking now 80 years ago, and there's nobody around to tell the tale on that one.
Well, just a curious question. First of all, when did they switch from aluminum to glass? When did they switch back? And how long were lacquers made?
Okay, how high is up and how small is small?
Hey, you're the expert.
Yeah. Essentially, at NBC, there was almost a turnover right at the beginning of Pearl Harbor Day to glass. They had it in stock because, obviously, because of the war effort, they couldn't get aluminum, so they had to revert to glass. So from a period, you could safely say most places, somewhere in 42, when they ran out of their old stock of aluminums, they had to go to glass. And what was prominent in New York, I noticed, were Presto blanks, then audio discs, audio devices, which became audio tape. But as the war progressed, God, what Presto made, the substrate got thinner and thinner, and the disc became more and more fragile. And some of them also were subject to not being made properly, and they would start to delaminate at the edge. I've seen that happen. The first of the aluminum start coming in at audio disc. Somewhere, the earliest one I have is in August of 44. But those were their earliest formulations. A lot of them have delaminated. And I found out why. One, the lacquer wasn't made right, but the aluminum they were getting was so impure, it almost looked like it was oxidized, which meant that when they put it in the bath and let it dry, the lacquer never really adhered to the base properly to begin with. And it just took a few decades of it just sitting there, and the lacquer just would delaminate when you hit it with water to clean it, or if it had any palmitic acid on it. As you would clean it, the lacquer would just, break, and you'd have to look very carefully and see if there was any sort of crazing on underneath the palmitic acid. If it did, you had to clean it another way without using soap and water on it.
Okay, and when do lacquers stop being used?
Let's see. Well, NBC Radio was cutting lacquers as late as 1972.
1972.
That's
really?
right. We have it in R&H. We had it in R&H in the Bell telephone. The Bell telephone when it went off the air in 71, 72. And I forget who told me the reason why they were still cutting lacquers was because of the engineers that were there and the union. These were old timers. They never wanted to deal with tape. And those are the latest lacquers I've ever seen cut coarse groove 16-inch. There were, of course, a ton of micro groove 12-inch cut. For references, quick references. Many a times when you hear sound effects on television, like when you watch The Honeymooners and he's trying to start the car and the car doesn't start up, that's a catch sound effect that is on a disc that they would have a turntable off to the side with the loudspeakers just to give the sound of a car trying to start up on a stage. And you can hear it in some of the 50 shows. That same car, when they want to try to get a car to start and it doesn't happen, it's the same pat sound effect. So there were these LPs that were out, and also sometimes they would cut lacquers. I remember, who was it, Joe? You went to interview Henry Sosnick, remember, one time? A long time. And he was part of Tin Pan Alley. He wound up at NBC as a music arranger for television. And one of the things that Joe had brought up was the fact that he was the music advisor for the very famous Ernie Kovacs silent show, the one with no dialogue. And he regaled Joe with the story that, oh God, he said we had a dozen turntables lined up, cued with different sound effects as Ernie did stuff, that we had to have, on the button, hold the record and then let it go and let that sound effect go as he was doing something, and then and have somebody at the next turntable to be cued for the next sound effect. Because they said doing it on tape and splicing it with leader was too slow. To push the button didn't happen. They had to have an instantaneous sound. And that's the way they used to do early.
You mean the mechanism of the tape recorder was too slow?
Too slow.
For an instantaneous.
Right, or sometimes he wanted, one sound effect may have wanted to come into the other. There was no way to do it. You had to do a mix between the two turntables. You'd have to make a tape copy in order to replicate that. But sometimes if Ernie was a little slow, if they did that overlap, he wouldn't be in sync with the sound effect. This way, the guys would watch him and they would let the turntables go. But that's how they used to do things in the early days of television, and Sosnick was part of that. He said how they created, cutting those lacquers, creating the sound he wanted, and then getting it synced for the program as they were doing it live.
I want to not completely, but I want to go off on a big tangent.
Yeah.
And I want to get away from lacquers, and I want to talk more about pressings for a moment. Because they behave differently, do they not?
Yeah.
And so I want to talk about shellac pressings, I want to talk about vinyl pressings, I want to talk about metal parts, because I assume that you play all of those things back.
Yeah.
Would you please explain the difference between those three things and how you would treat a vinyl pressing, a shellac pressing, and the metal part if you were going to have to play them back, and why you would have to play, or why you might want to play them back?
All right, if you're dealing with even commercially issued or non-commercially issued records, it's always the result of a three metal part process. The original is cut originally in heated wax and later into lacquers, which was then put into an electroplated bath to create an image of it, which was a negative known as a master or mother. Every company had a different terminology for it. Some called it a father, depending on which record company you were at. That metal part would then be created when they would either break the wax or separate the original lacquer off of it. There are two movies on YouTube you can look to see the difference concerning 78s and LPs. They were both done by RCA. One is called How a 78 is Made, one is called How an LP is Made. The 78 one is from 1942, and it has Milton Cross narrating it. The one about the LP actually shows part of a recording session with Charles Munch and the Boston Symphony, with Richard Moore, one of the esteemed engineer producers at RCA back in the 50s, at the in the control booth. What happens then is once that master is created, it's then put into the electroplated bath again, and they create what's called a shell or a mold. I remember at RCA it was marked that way. And that was an invert of the negative, which is a positive, which could be played with a standard stylus like a pressing. From that, they would then put it into the bath a third time, and there was different combinations of nickel and chromium that they would plate as they were doing it, the different layers that they would actually put on the mold to make it resilient so it doesn't wear out from constant growing of another part and separating it. And from that, they would make what's called a stamper. The stamper was what went into the press, which was a negative again, with a large center hole so they could put the label in. And that's where they would have the heated shellac that looked like a, you'll see it in the video. I don't know, it looks like the pressing, yeah. To make the final pressing, the heated shellac that looked like a brick, a heated brick that they would cut and then plop in there, and then they would bring the two metal parts together for sides A and B, making sure they put the labels on. And from that, they would wait until it cooled down, and then they would separate the stampers, and you would have a pressing. Now, in the 78 RPM area, it was made out of primarily shellac as one piece, unless you were in French HMV, where they had a core, just like they had at American Columbia. It was a different type of biscuit, as it was called. And when I'm doing stuff, if I'm doing something for a major company and they have everything available, I always say, send me the master, the negative.
Why?
The best sound possible. That's the one that is the first electroplated off the original disc or wax. And a number of things I did for BMG in the Toscanini collection, where we had those original masters, are some of the best things that came out in that series. The record that has the Grand Canyon Suite on it was entirely from all the original negative masters.
We talked about this a very little bit at the beginning.
Yeah.
But you never, and you explained about the bifurcated stylus. But you never explained exactly if you play them the same way, for example, as you play regular 78s or anything else. What would be the difference between playing, let's say, a master like that and playing a regular 78?
Okay. I don't have the stylus in here, but you'll see the difference. You have to remember, if the record is now an inverse, you're playing ridges versus valleys, because of the fact now that it is a reflection, it's an inverse of the actual disc you're playing. You also have to play the disc in reverse to get the sound off of it, because now it's an inverse of the positive.
Is that hard to do?
Not after I started working on it 30-odd years ago for BMG. I found an engineer. I have an SP15 that I take out of here that goes in reverse. And it works perfectly. And then I had to come up with something else. Then I called up Tom, who was dealing with the styli, and I was in Brooklyn. I drove out to Plainview, which wasn't far from here, where Stanton had its factory. I said, Tom, tell them to make every bifurcated stylus they have in stock. And I've got every one of them, all 6 of them, that play anything from LPs to early acoustics. But then I realized when I set the turntable up and I'm ready to play it, I said, wait a minute. If I play the record and the stylus is going this way on a normal record, on a negative, the record is going in this direction, the cantilever is going to snap, because instead of it going in the direction of the cantilever, it's going against it. The cantilever will break off and fold over. So I remembered a friend of mine had given me one of these. This is the only one that I was ever able to find a head shelf by AudioQuest that was big enough that I can mount the cartridge in backwards. And then I had SME. I tried it myself, and then I had them make me up an extra set of extra long signal cables that go to the connectors and to the back of the cartridge.
That sounds very clever.
It took a little bit of work, but it worked. And let's put it this way, this is all, no one taught me this. I had to sit there and say, now, how am I going to make this mousetrap work? And it took a little bit of timing. And I couldn't believe it. The first time I got this set up and dropped the stylus on it, I couldn't believe the sound I was getting.
So the results were definitely better.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you don't realize how awful some of these commercial pressings are because of the lousy shellac they used.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, well.
Is shellac, you mean one record is different than another?
Oh, boy. Yeah. Any collector will tell you some of the worst pressings were done by American Decca in the 30s. They had so much grit in them. But that could go on for another 2 hours. There were various grades of shellac that was being used, and those of us in the business who know, early Columbia Electric sound better than early Victors, but by the 30s, Victor took over with their, as Peter Mumby says, Z pressings. Yeah, I want everything on screwbacks for the screwballs. But that's an inside joke. Some of you are laughing now because you have met the great RPM, the man who came up with Beethoven's greatest hits. And Shagging with Chopin, was it? Was one of his last ones?
No comment.
Okay, you were there when that happened. Good thing the camera's not on you right now. But invariably, if the metal part is not worn out from being plated too much, and that was the beauty of doing that interim positive, was to prevent the original master from being put into the bath again to create another. Originally, Fred Geisberg wrote about it. They ran into this problem with the first masters they made on the first Caruso sessions. They would cut it into zinc, I think, and then they would put the plating on it. And they actually used those in the presses to make the first pressings back in 1901. And all of a sudden there was a demand for all of these Caruso records, and he went down to the plant. They were having a problem. He noted some masters had started to burn from being pressed too much. The heat just destroyed them. And that's why in the next session Caruso did, there are a number of songs that duplicate the first session. He had to redo them because they had to put them back in the catalog. So those first pressings are very rare. But that's when they decided at that point they had to go to a 3-step process. They just couldn't plate the original zinc mold, which then became wax, and use that. There was only a finite number of pressings you can make before the metal would actually start to burn. So that's why we go to this 3-step process. And the beauty of that is that positive can be used many times to create the stampers. And sometimes they would take that original master and make a number of positives, and those are the ones they send to their foreign distribution, and they told them, this is what you use to make your stampers. You do it there.
So that's why sometimes a foreign pressing might even sound better than a domestic pressing.
Depending on where it was recorded, and not so much that, but it had to deal with the vinyl. Not the vinyl, the shellac that they used. And the funny thing is, many a times recordings made in England, you'll find better pressings on them in French copies or Electrola copies, or sometimes Australian copies, which were the quietest. However, I think in Australia they may have polished the masters to make them quieter, which was a process that took sometimes the high-end frequencies off the metal part. That it sounds quieter, but it's duller.
So it can be very complicated
Oh,
determining what to use.
it's such a mess. Generally, a lot of people, if you can get through the fibering noise of all those cacti that were used.
You'll have to explain that too.
Yeah, that was something in England. See, the problem is we don't realize it, as I explained one time at a New York Arts conference meeting, that if you look at some of these NBC reference lacquers, it says not to be plated with a stylus greater than 3 ounces. Now let's do a little math here, folks. There are 28.5 grams per ounce. The modern LP is suggested, like with the Shore Styli or Grado, going no higher than 1 3/4 grams. So now we're putting on a lacquer, a coarse cut lacquer, 3 times 28.5 grams. And that was considered light in its day in the 40s and 50s. I think the weight from the steel needles in those acoustic playbacks and early electrics, well, when they went to a cartridge, was in pounds. And they used to do what was called wear tests on these discs. A record could be musically correct. They played it 20 times. On the 21st time, if they heard any blasting or stealing, as it was called, it was rejected. Even though musically it's fine.
So that might mean a better sounding record would be rejected for worse sounding.
And that's when they found certain things in the vault where they put things out. And now, because of modern playback purposes, because they had the test pressings of the metals, they could play them now. But the point being, let's see. Now, let me get back on track about this. I had a thought. It also had to deal with what happened in England was they heard the stealing. That's what it was. And they decided, oh, we're going to use cactus instead as a stylus. And Pathé did too. I remember my late great uncle had bought one of the Pathé machines, and he once showed me, and I never kept it because he must have thrown it out. I remember as a kid, he had the actual sharpener for the Pathé cactus styli that went into his phonograph. And it looked like, I remember the shape of it looked something like this, a V. And it had the offset. So you put the piece of cactus in and you turned it a number of times, and the razor in there would create a new stylus for you. The problem with cactus was it was organic like shellac, and when you mix two organic compounds together under a lot of heat and pressure, which is what happens when you play a record, the shellac chemically combines into the cactus chemically combines into the shellac.
And what happens when that happens?
Oh, you get something, as they used to call as frying bacon. It's got this background noise on it that I remember Cedar telling me when they were first coming up with the declick modules. They figured out there was something like several thousand clicks per second in there, which was the result. That's what they told me at the time, which was the result of playing things with a fibered stylus. The record's rarely worn out. In other words, you wouldn't get the stealing or stripped grooves. But boy, you got an awful lot of noise.
So you can't always tell what a record is going to sound like by looking at it?
Well, you look at the label, and if you get something made in England, it's like, oh boy, here we go. Or British, anything from England itself. Australia is a different story. France is, but anything that says made in England, guaranteed you're going to put it on, and it's going to be noisy.
So not only do you have to look to see how worn a record is, can you see that, by the way?
Sometimes you can if it's been really stripped out. You see gray areas.
Okay, so you look at a record and you can determine to some degree its condition visually.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have to look at the quality of the pressing, and then you have to look at what country it came from. Boy, this gets awfully complicated.
No kidding. And wait a minute, we haven't even determined the speed of the playback curves yet, like we were talking about before.
That's true.
And the other thing of cleaning the record.
Okay, I'll ask the question I asked you before. I give you a record set, and I say, I want it transferred. How long does it take you? If you want to do it, if I say, I want your best you can do, how long does it take you?
You mean to create a...
Now, you only are working from one record set. I'll ask a follow-up question in a minute. But I give you a shellac set of Beethoven Symphony, and I say, that's about 30 minutes, 28 minutes long. How long will it take you to transfer it to give me the best quality sound you can?
I would say it'd probably take, depending on the condition and everything, I'd say it'd run about 15 hours to really get it down to what I want it to be.
So a long time, even longer than doing the
Oh yeah,
wipers.
generally if discs are in fairly good shape and they want something as a reference, generally it's a 4-to-1 ratio. In other words, for every hour of finished product, it will take 4 hours to produce. If it has no problems, like I don't have to go into retouch and start going after one event after another.
What if it's worn?
And it's one event after another, it could bump up to 6 to 10 hours, depending.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it all depends. If it's the only known copy and that's the only thing you have to work with, well, it's going to take that amount of time.
Okay, let's take that one step further. I'm not an individual, I'm a record company. And I say to you, money's no object. I know that's music to your ears. Although you won't get to see any of it. Money is no object. We need to have the best quality product of this Benny Goodman because we're putting it out and we want you to find the best copy. What do you do?
Generally, I'll check with a network of collectors to find the best copy, and then what is it? And then start working on it. Going through the whole process of cleaning, pitching, and everything else.
So would you get more than one copy?
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes intercutting between two copies because one may have a problem at the beginning, another one may have a problem at the end. I've done that too.
Well, why would that be? They're the same, aren't they?
Different playback equipment was used on it, different styli that hit it in different ways.
So you're saying one might be more worn than the other in different spots, and you might be able to use one.
Right.
Okay.
Or get around a certain problem. And the beauty of digital editing is you can take the whole thing and intercut or even just sew two pieces together and do it seamlessly. And with retouch, sometimes fooling around with the surface noise and rumble, you'd never know, an intercut was done, as we call it, or just taking from one half into another.
Rumble. You didn't mention that before. What's that?
Rumble. That's the result of the turntable that it was being cut on. Those were all generally puck-driven. And the pucks got very noisy, especially on lacquers from NBC in the 40s. They didn't maintain their equipment. What happens is it's a vibration that goes up into the recording.
What does it sound like?
Or it could sound like a hum. It sounds like some noise. It's like a train going by sometimes very quietly. It's the equivalent like if you're playing a record and you go over and you bang the turntable, the table it's on, and you hear a thump. That's the equivalent of it. But it's constant.
And can you get rid of that?
Yeah. There are ways of removing it in retouch or not filtering it in certain ways. Joe, do you think we're toward the end of the session as of right now? Okay. Well, do an outro, John, and we'll... can we play something as we're going out? In other words, another example?
Yeah.
Okay, and then we'll end it with that, and then we'll continue the discussion and go from there. What I'd like to play next, and I'll show you something here, is this disc. And this is what we'll end with. This is Penyanko nearly a year later. His sound has gotten a lot better, but you'll hear some pitch instability in it and a lot of noises, and some of them I've worked on. And when we come back, I'll show you how I fixed some of the problems in this to a certain extent. But this is the very end of the Rienzi Overture from December 3rd, 1938, off of this glass disc that is starting to delaminate. And the thing is, I will not put this up on a Monk's machine. I'll play it the way it is. Because if you hit it, that lacquer where it's delaminating will absolutely fly off the disc. And that's not retrievable at all. So here we go. December 3rd, 38, Mirko Penyanko once more. The end of the Rienzi Overture, Toscanini and the NBC Symphony on December 3rd, 1938. Whoops. By the way, that was unusual with Penyanko. He usually clipped off the applause immediately to make it sound like a studio recording.
Now, why would he do that?
It was something in his head. I got other things from a guy by the name of J.W. Small. He outdoes Penyanko, sometimes just clipping the last note, not to get even a clap. I don't know what the mentality was, but what can I tell you?
That was pretty amazing. Even
It
more
is.
so than the other disc, just as you said.
Right. It has pitch instability. You'll see that. I'll show some things and what I have done to clean it up, and there's still problems in there, and I'll show you how those can come out. But this is like one of those where, like I said, the girl with the curl, when she's bad, she's bad. And this took a bit to figure out what stylist would play this thing. It took a couple of trials to get that kind of sound.
Well, I have to say, Seth, this has been really fascinating.
Well, thank you.
And we're going to do it again.
We're going to continue.
We're going to continue this in part 2, where Seth will show you all his little tricks that he hasn't already shown you thus far.
And some more show and tell and other things and certain processes. We still haven't even gone into to show you where this system is, which is the Sadie system that I record on. And here is what I do all my processing on, which is the Cedar Cambridge system. And this is their latest version 12. That has some incredible bells and whistles on it. There we go. Come on, let's go. There we go. And these are all the different modules. Oh, quiet. The different modules that I use to get things going. Namely, this is the NR5, which is the noise reduction we're moving here. 3 different stages of declick and decrackle. Here is the 2-channel realignment, mono summing, or if I have to do vertical cancellation, here's the phase corrector and a level corrector. Very powerful, and that was what was used on the on all of the stuff you heard tonight. But you still need the retouch to get out some of the other finer problems in it.
Well, this is really fascinating, and I look forward to discussing this further. On that note, thank
Okay.
you to our videographer, Joe Patridge.
Patridge, yes.
And thanks to you, Seth, and this has been fabulous.
Well, thank
we
you,
look forward
John.
to the next time.
Absolutely. There's more to come and more fun.
That there is. Good night, everyone.